The Pacific Ocean, vast, eternal, and deceptively calm. In 1941, the world was already burning, in Europe, in Africa, in the skies over Britain. But across these endless blue waters, America still slept, untouched by war. The sun rose every morning over Hawaii. Sailors polished decks, families laughed on the beaches. The ocean whispered peace. But beneath that calm surface, storms were gathering. Far across the sea, in Tokyo, plans were unfolding. Plans that would shatter the illusion of safety forever. December 7th, 1941. A Sunday morning in paradise. At 7:55 a.m., the first Japanese aircraft broke through the clouds. The hum of engines echoed across Oahu. A sound that would change history. The bombs fell in waves. The USS Arizona took a direct hit. Fire consumed steel. Men dove into oil-covered water as ships burned around them. The Pacific, once blue and still, turned black and red. Within 2 hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay crippled. Battleships sunk. Planes destroyed on the ground. 2,403 Americans dead. The attack was not just military, it was psychological. It woke a sleeping giant. President Franklin D. Roosevelt would call it a date which will live in infamy. The next day, America declared war on Japan, and by extension, on the Axis powers. The Pacific was no longer peaceful. It had become the stage of the greatest naval war in human history. The attack on Pearl Harbor left America wounded, but not broken. Within weeks, the nation began to rebuild. Across the United States, factories roared to life. Men and women worked around the clock, forging a new fleet, faster, stronger, more powerful than ever before. The aircraft carrier would become the new titan of the seas, a floating city capable of projecting power across oceans. The enemy had awakened something unstoppable. American industry, American resolve, and American vengeance. New heroes began to rise. Pilots, sailors, engineers, Marines. The Pacific became a testing ground, not just for machines, but for the human spirit. Each man knew the next battle would decide not just survival, but the future of freedom itself. In April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, America struck back. 16 B-25 bombers took off from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, a mission no one thought possible. Their target, Tokyo. The Doolittle raid wasn't meant to destroy. It was meant to send a message. We can reach you. You are not safe. Though the raid caused little physical damage, it lifted American morale and forced Japan to rethink its strategy. The sleeping giant was now fully awake. The Japanese Empire, humiliated and enraged, turned its attention to a small, remote atoll, a speck of land that would soon decide the fate of the Pacific. Its name was Midway. June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Japan launched its most ambitious operation yet, to lure and destroy what remained of the U.S. Navy. But American codebreakers had done the impossible. They cracked Japan's secret communication codes. They knew when, where, and how the attack would come. When the Japanese fleet arrived at Midway, the Americans were waiting. The stage was set for one of the most decisive naval battles in history. On June 4th, American dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet took off into stormy skies. Their mission, find the Japanese fleet, or die trying. When they did find it, the ocean erupted. In just 5 minutes, American bombs hit 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, setting them ablaze. By the end of the day, Japan had lost 4 carriers. The tide had turned. Midway was more than a victory. It was a message written in fire and steel that the Pacific belonged to no one, and that its fate would be decided only through unimaginable sacrifice. The Japanese advance had been stopped, but the road ahead would be long and filled with blood. The Pacific was now a vast graveyard of ships, planes, and dreams. But in the distance, beyond the horizon, a new kind of war was beginning. Island by island, mile by mile, the long road to Japan. The victory at Midway had changed everything, but it was only the beginning. The Japanese empire still stretched across the Pacific like a shadow. From the jungles of New Guinea to the coral reefs of the Solomon Islands, they had built fortresses in paradise. The United States now faced a brutal reality. To win, they would have to take every island, one by one. The Pacific War was about to become a test of endurance, of men, machines, and the very will to survive. August 7th, 1942. The U.S. Marines landed on a small, humid island in the Solomons, Guadalcanal. It was supposed to be an easy victory. Instead, it became a nightmare. Dense jungle, disease, monsoon rain. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Japanese snipers hid in the trees. Night raids struck like ghosts. The Marines called it hell in the Pacific. But they held, inch by inch, hill by hill. The battle raged for 6 months, a living hell of mud, blood, and fear. When it ended, 7,000 Americans and 30,000 Japanese were dead. But America had won its first ground victory in the Pacific. Guadalcanal taught both sides a deadly truth. The Pacific would not be won by fleets alone. It would be fought by men, with rifles, in the mud, against fear itself. Back home, the American war machine thundered forward. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles turned raw steel into weapons of vengeance. Aircraft carriers, bombers, and amphibious tanks rolled off assembly lines faster than Japan could sink them. The arsenal of democracy had reached full power. And now, it was moving west. The Pacific now roared with engines, hundreds of ships and planes carrying the hope of a nation. The next targets, Tarawa, the Marshalls, and the Marianas, stepping stones to Japan itself. November 20th, 1943. The Battle of Tarawa. A tiny coral atoll, just 1 square mile in size. Japanese forces had fortified it with bunkers, artillery, and barbed wire. They promised that 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. The Marines took it in 76 hours, but at a terrible cost. The first waves of landing craft ran aground on the reef. Marines waded hundreds of yards through open water under heavy fire. Bodies floated in the surf. Blood turned the lagoon red. When it was over, 1,000 Marines were dead. 4,000 Japanese lay buried in the sand. The world saw the footage, raw, unfiltered, horrifying, and understood what the Pacific truly was. Not a campaign, but a crucible. Each island was a new lesson in suffering. Each victory, a monument built on sacrifice. America learned to fight smarter, to combine sea, air, and land in perfect coordination. The island-hopping campaign had begun, and Japan was losing ground, 1 coral reef at a time. June 1944, the invasion of Saipan. This was not just another island. Saipan was within striking distance of Tokyo itself. If America took it, the Japanese homeland would be within reach of the new long-range B-29 bombers. The Japanese knew it, and they fought like demons. The beaches ran red again. The mountains echoed with artillery fire. Civilians jumped from cliffs, told by their leaders that Americans would torture them. It was the most haunting side of the war, a tragedy that scarred everyone who witnessed it. When SAIPAN fell, Japan's prime minister resigned. The empire had been breached. America now controlled the airfields that would bring the war to Japan's doorstep, and with them, the power to rain fire from the heavens. The Pacific was changing, from blue to crimson, from ocean to inferno. The island chain was almost complete. The next battles would be fought not for land, but for survival. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the final gates before Japan itself. The world was about to witness the most brutal clashes in naval history. The moment when courage and horror would become indistinguishable. By 1945, the Pacific Ocean had become a graveyard. From Guadalcanal to Saipan, island after island had fallen. Japan's empire was shrinking, but the cost was unimaginable. Now, only two gates remained between America and Japan itself: Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They were not just islands, they were fortresses, carved from rock and fire. What came next would not be a battle, but a descent into hell. February 19th, 1945. The U.S. Marines landed on the black sands of Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island halfway between Saipan and Tokyo. The Japanese defenders, 21,000 strong, were waiting underground. They had built miles of tunnels beneath Mount Suribachi, bunkers carved into stone, and hidden artillery aimed at the beaches. The Americans never saw them until the sand exploded. For 5 weeks, the battle raged without pause. The Marines advanced yard by yard under constant sniper and mortar fire. Flamethrowers burned through tunnels. Tanks crawled over scorched ground. There were no safe places, only survival. On the 5th day, a group of Marines climbed Mount Suribachi. They planted a flag, a small moment in the inferno. Joe Rosenthal captured it with his camera. That photograph, 6 men raising the American flag, became the symbol of sacrifice, of brotherhood, of hope in the darkest hour. But the battle was far from over. Even after the flag rose, the killing continued for weeks. Out of 21,000 Japanese soldiers, only 200 were taken alive. 6,800 Americans died on that island of black ash. Iwo Jima was won. But the victory felt hollow. It was a glimpse of the nightmare still to come. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. The largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War began, Okinawa. Over 1,500 ships and 180,000 troops surged toward the island, the final stepping stone before Japan itself. But what awaited them was beyond imagination. The Japanese strategy was not to stop the landings, but to bleed America dry. Thousands of soldiers dug deep into caves and ridges. And from the skies came a new terror, the kamikaze. Pilots who turned their planes into weapons, guided not by radar, but by devotion. Kamikazes struck relentlessly, over 1,900 attacks in just 2 months. Ships burned. Sailors jumped into oil-slicked water. The ocean was on fire once again. Okinawa became a storm of steel and death. On land, the Marines fought through caves and ridges, one hill at a time. The cost was staggering. 12,000 Americans dead, 100,000 Japanese soldiers, and tens of thousands of civilians caught in between, many choosing death over surrender. Okinawa was hell made real. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa broke Japan's military and broke America's heart. The victory came at such cost that every commander wondered, if this is what it takes to take one island, what will it take to invade Japan itself? Estimates said 1 million Allied lives could be lost. And yet, even as soldiers bled and ships burned, the world beyond the battlefield was preparing a weapon that would change everything and end everything. But before that weapon could be revealed, before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the men of the Pacific carried the scars of war home. They had faced something beyond imagination, and won, at a price no one could truly understand. The Pacific had been conquered, but at what cost? As the fleet sailed toward the horizon, the ocean that had once promised freedom now carried ghosts. The world was standing on the edge of a new and terrible dawn. The fires of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had opened humanity's eyes to a terrible truth. That courage alone could not stop the devastation of modern war. As the last survivors looked back at the smoking islands behind them, they carried the memory of brothers lost and the burden of what was still to come. The Pacific was silent again, but the silence was only the breath before the storm. The next sound would be the roar of the atom. The war between oceans was nearly over, but the war for humanity's soul had just begun. May 1945. Germany had fallen. In Europe, guns finally fell silent. But in the Pacific, the war raged on. America stood poised to invade Japan, a nation that vowed to fight to the last man, the last breath, the last island. Behind closed doors, a new weapon was being prepared. A weapon so terrible that it could end the war in a single stroke, or end the world itself. Deep in the deserts of New Mexico, the Manhattan Project had forged a new kind of fire. The best minds of a generation, Oppenheimer, Fermi, Teller, worked in secrecy. On July 16, 1945, they watched the sky ignite over Trinity Site. The first atomic explosion turned night into day and sand into glass. Oppenheimer whispered words from ancient scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Within weeks, 2 bombs were ready, Little Boy and Fat Man. President Truman faced an unthinkable choice: invade Japan and lose 1 million lives, or unleash a weapon never used before on human beings. August 6, 1945. The B-29 Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island. Its target, Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb fell. For 43 seconds, the world held its breath. Then, light, brighter than 1,000 suns. The city vanished in an instant, tens of thousands killed, tens of thousands more burned and blinded. A mushroom cloud rose 5 miles into the sky, casting a shadow that would never fade. The world had crossed a threshold. Humanity had split the atom and its own conscience. 3 days later, as Tokyo hesitated, a second mission took off. August 9, 1945, Fat Man fell on Nagasaki, another city erased. The shockwaves rolled across mountains and harbor, a final message that the empire could no longer ignore. In a single week, 2 blinding suns rose over Japan. Emperor Hirohito spoke to his people for the first time. In a measured, trembling voice, he said, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage." On August 15th, Japan surrendered. The Pacific Inferno was finally extinguished. Across the Pacific, guns fell silent. Soldiers wept, some from relief, some from guilt. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. Yet from the ashes, something else rose, a resolve that such horror must never happen again. The United Nations was born from that promise. In the United States, the victors returned home, young men aged by flame. They built families, cities, and a future that their fallen brothers never would. The Pacific Inferno had ended in light so bright it burned shadows into stone. From the depths of war came lessons for all time, that progress without compassion is destruction, that peace is harder to build than any weapon, and that the oceans we fight across are the same oceans that connect us all. The Pacific was quiet again, and the world forever changed. From ashes and light, humanity stepped into a new age. The Inferno had ended, but its echo still burns in our history. August 15th, 1945. The guns had gone silent. Japan lay in ruins. Cities once alive with laughter were now fields of ash. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, but it mixed with something new. Relief. Across the Pacific, the victors and the vanquished looked out to the same ocean and wondered what would come next. For America, the war had ended in triumph, but also in trauma. Soldiers returned home carrying both medals and memories too heavy to bear. For Japan, it was surrender, but also survival. The emperor's voice had broken centuries of silence. The nation would now have to rebuild not just its cities, but its soul. When American forces landed in Japan, they expected resistance. Instead, they found a people too exhausted to fight. Under General Douglas MacArthur, the U.S. occupation began, not with vengeance, but vision. Japan's weapons were dismantled, its constitution rewritten. Factories that once built bombers began producing bicycles and radios. Children went to school under new textbooks that spoke of peace, not conquest. The transformation was staggering. In less than a decade, a shattered empire became an industrial miracle. Japan rose again, not as a conqueror, but as a creator. The ashes of war gave birth to the hum of new machines, the glow of neon cities, and a culture that embraced both tradition and technology. Across the ocean, millions of Americans came home. They were called the greatest generation. Some returned to build suburbs, start families, and invent the modern world. Others carried invisible wounds, memories of jungle fire, steel rain, and friends lost to the sea. Their silence spoke louder than any speech. From those veterans came stories, books, and films, an entire culture shaped by both pride and pain. The war had ended, but its echo continued in every family photograph, every folded flag. Out of the Pacific Inferno came a new global balance. America emerged as a superpower, its factories unstoppable, its fleets unmatched. The Soviet Union, once an ally, became the new rival. And in between them, the world stood divided by ideology, fear, and atomic firepower. The Cold War had begun, a different kind of war, fought in shadows rather than storms. Yet, even amid that tension, lessons from the Pacific endured. The horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became the cornerstone of peace movements. Scientists who once built bombs now spoke of restraint. Soldiers who once fought across islands now met their former enemies as allies. The Pacific War was more than battles and borders. It was a story of what humanity can endure and what it must never repeat. From Guadalcanal to Hiroshima, from courage to catastrophe, the Pacific taught one final lesson: that peace, like victory, must be fought for, not with bombs or battleships, but with understanding, compassion, and the strength to forgive. The oceans that once burned with war now carry ships of trade and friendship. The same sky that witnessed fire now watches over cities of light. The Pacific, once an inferno, has become a bridge between nations. Decades have passed. The veterans have grown old. Their voices fade, but their legacy burns eternal in the freedom we inherit and the peace we protect. The Pacific Inferno was a war between oceans, but its lessons belong to all of humanity. For from that sea of fire, we learned the cost of hatred and the power of hope. History is not just what we remember. It is what we choose to learn. And so, from the ashes of the Pacific, a new world was born. The fire has gone out, but its light will forever guide us. The guns had fallen silent, but the dead still spoke. From the jungles of the Philippines to the reefs of Micronesia, the ghosts of the Pacific waited to be found. American recovery teams searched for lost aircraft, sunken submarines, and the missing thousands. In Japan, survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki began to tell their stories. The hibakusha, whose shadows were burned into walls, yet whose voices lit the path toward peace. The Pacific had become a graveyard and a classroom. From its depths rose questions of morality, survival, and forgiveness that would haunt humanity for generations. 1949. The world was split again, not by oceans, but by ideologies. The same factories that built warplanes now built jets for a new kind of enemy. In China, a revolution rose. In Korea, fire returned to the Pacific Rim. The Cold War had begun, and the Pacific became the front line once more. The oceans that once carried soldiers now carried missiles. The atomic fire that ended one war now threatened to start another. Beneath the calm waves, the war continued in silence. Submarines stalked each other in the dark. Spy networks spread from Tokyo to Manila, from Hawaii to Hong Kong. The Pacific was no longer just a battlefield. It was a chessboard of shadows. But even in espionage, humanity flickered through. Spies who saved lives, soldiers who defied orders to prevent catastrophe. The Pacific had changed, but its storms had not yet passed. Across Asia and the Pacific, nations rebuilt, not only with steel, but with spirit. Japan embraced democracy. The Philippines found independence. Hawaii became a bridge between East and West. And yet, memories of fire lingered in songs, in prayers, in generations who could not forget. Religion and art began to fill the silence where bombs once fell. From Hiroshima's peace bell to Okinawa's caves of remembrance, faith became a flame that healed rather than destroyed. Time moves like the tide. It washes away, but it never forgets. The Pacific today is a mirror of tragedy, of triumph, of transformation. Its waves carry the memories of those who fought and those who forgave. The inferno has faded, but the ocean still whispers its story, a story of humanity's darkest hour and brightest dawn. "1945 had ended the world's greatest war, but peace was fragile. The old empires had fallen, yet new powers were rising. The United States, once a reluctant giant, now stood as a colossus. The Soviet Union, bloodied but defiant, claimed half of Europe and looked east. In the ashes of the Pacific, a new conflict was taking shape, not of bombs and battleships, but of ideology, influence, and fear. The Cold War had begun. The oceans that once burned with war now carried ships of occupation, relief, and ambition. The United States rebuilt Japan, while the Soviets fortified China's borders. The Pacific had not found peace, only a new kind of tension. In China, the victory over Japan was followed by another war. One that would decide the fate of 1 billion souls. The nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong had fought together against Japan. Now, they turned their guns on each other. Villages that had celebrated liberation now echoed with new gunfire. Fields that once fed soldiers now fed revolution. The Pacific powers watched closely. America backed the nationalists. The Soviets armed the communists. It was not just a civil war. It was the first shadow war of the New Age. By 1949, Mao's red banners rose over Beijing. The People's Republic of China was born, and with it, a new balance of fear. To the west, it was a nightmare, realized. Another ocean's edge lost to communism. The Cold War's Pacific Front had begun. June 25, 1950, dawn broke over the 38th parallel. North Korean troops crossed the border in a storm of fire. Seoul fell within days. The world, exhausted by one war, was plunged into another. Under the flag of the United Nations, 21 nations rallied, led by America. It was no longer just a regional conflict. It was the first open battle of the Cold War. China entered the war. Soviet pilots flew in secret. The Pacific, once again, was ablaze. For 3 bitter years, mountains became graves. The front lines froze in ice and blood. And when the guns fell silent in 1953, the world was right back where it started, divided by a line and haunted by fear. In the shadow of Korea, both East and West raced for dominance of the atom. America tested the hydrogen bomb in the Pacific, explosions so vast they vaporized islands. The Soviets followed. The same ocean that once echoed with battleships now thundered with nuclear shockwaves. The Pacific had become the world's proving ground for weapons, for ideology, for humanity itself. Fishermen found their nets glowing from fallout. Islanders were displaced from ancestral homes. The price of peace had become invisible, radiation carried by wind and water. Yet, even as nations tested destruction, voices of conscience rose. Scientists who once built bombs now begged for restraint. The Pacific's calm waves had seen enough of mankind's fury. By the mid-1950s, the Pacific had changed forever. Japan rose as an ally. China stood firm under the red flag. Korea was divided. The United States ruled the waves. The Soviet Union shadowed every move. The war had never truly ended. It had only changed its shape. The Pacific, once an inferno of fire, had become an arena of nerves. Missiles replaced torpedoes, satellites replaced scouts, and humanity stood one mistake away from annihilation. The next war, if it came, would not be fought for islands, but for the survival of civilization itself. The guns had fallen silent. The smoke of Hiroshima, of Seoul, had faded into history. But beneath the calm surface of the Pacific, war had not ended. It had gone underwater, into the shadows, where men fought unseen. The Cold War wasn't fought only with bombs and politics. It was fought with whispers, wires, and waves. The oceans became chessboards. Submarines replaced fleets. Intelligence replaced invasion. Welcome to the silent war, where one wrong signal could start the end of the world. During World War II, submarines were predators of supply lines. In the Cold War, they became something else entirely, guardians of annihilation. The U.S. Navy launched its silent service, nuclear-powered submarines armed with ballistic missiles. The Soviets answered with their own, prowling the Pacific depths like wolves beneath the waves. Each submarine carried enough firepower to destroy nations, yet their crews lived in darkness, unseen, unheard. Weeks underwater. No sunlight, just the hum of the reactor and the whisper of orders that could end the world. Accidents were inevitable. Boats vanished. Families never got answers. The Pacific became a graveyard, not of heroes in daylight, but of ghosts in silence. But war wasn't only under the sea. It lived in radio waves, newspaper columns, and whispers in hotel rooms. The CIA and the KGB played their own naval war of intelligence. American agents in Tokyo, Soviet handlers in Hanoi. The Pacific was an ocean of secrets. One operation changed everything. Project Azorian. In 1974, a Soviet nuclear submarine sank in the Pacific. The CIA built a massive ship, the Glomar Explorer, to secretly retrieve it. They called it a mining project. But beneath the waves, America was stealing the enemy's deadliest secrets. The operation was half successful. They lifted part of the sub, buried its dead, and left a mystery unsolved. The Cold War's deepest secrets still sleep under the Pacific. Above the water, the war of minds raged. Radio-free Asia broadcast hope into communist states. Soviet transmitters fired back with songs of revolution. The Pacific Islands became listening posts, small dots of land hosting global propaganda. Films, leaflets, and rumors traveled faster than torpedoes. The battlefield had shifted, from oceans to information, from soldiers to stories. Each nation tried to claim the moral high ground. Yet beneath it all was the same fear. Who would control the future of the Pacific? In October 1962, the world stood seconds from annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis shook the Atlantic, but its echoes reached the Pacific. U.S. submarines in the Pacific were ordered to readiness. Soviet fleets vanished under the waves. For 13 days, humanity held its breath. When the crisis ended, the oceans stayed quiet. But everyone knew, one wrong signal could still end everything. The Pacific remained the balance point of peace and destruction. Beneath calm waters, hundreds of warheads still wait in silence, monuments to a war that was never fought, but never ended. The silence of the Pacific hides humanity's loudest secret, the constant readiness to destroy itself. The Pacific was vast enough to swallow the memories of war, yet the people who lived along its shores could never forget. Millions had died. Entire cities had burned. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Manila, Okinawa, Nanjing. The names were carved not just in stone, but in memory, in silence, in prayer. Beneath the oceans, thousands of ships rested in silence, grave markers for sailors from every nation. Coral grew over steel. Sharks swam through shattered decks. Time turned destruction into reefs of color. Strange kind of peace. But the living carried scars far deeper than any ocean trench. Widows, veterans, orphans, survivors of camps and bombings. Their bodies healed. Their memories did not. Out of the ashes, Japan rose, not as an empire, but as a symbol of rebirth. In the 1950s, Tokyo's streets buzzed with rebuilding. Children walked to schools built over ruins. Factories replaced arsenals. Cameras, radios, and cars replaced tanks. The Constitution renounced war. Forever, it said. Japan's greatest victory would no longer come through conquest, but creation. A new culture emerged, one that fused pain with imagination. Films like Godzilla turned trauma into myth. Anime, art, and technology became Japan's new armies, not of destruction, but of inspiration. But while Japan rebuilt, others struggled to heal. Korea remained divided, its family split by ideology and barbed wire. In the jungles of Vietnam, another generation fought, believing they were defending freedom or fighting imperialism. Across the Pacific, the wounds of colonization lingered. In the Philippines, independence came with scars of occupation. In Indonesia, revolution turned into rebellion. In the Pacific Islands, the memory of atomic testing haunted generations. But through suffering came unity, a shared voice rising across the ocean. Never again, they said. Never again shall we burn our skies. In the ruins of Nagasaki, a single cathedral bell survived the blast. It became a symbol of faith enduring even through fire. In temples, churches, and mosques across the Pacific, survivors prayed not for revenge, but for peace. Artisans rebuilt shrines. Monks planted gardens where bombs once fell. Faith, in all its forms, became the quiet answer to mankind's loudest mistakes. Even among former enemies, forgiveness took root. American and Japanese veterans met. They bowed to each other, one in apology, one in respect. The Pacific, once an inferno, now reflected a fragile peace. By the 1970s, the Pacific was changing again, not by conquest, but by culture. Music crossed borders. Trade replaced war. From Tokyo to Manila, Seoul to Sydney, a new Pacific generation was rising. One that saw itself not as divided by oceans, but connected by them. The fires of war had burned deep, but from them came faith. Faith in peace. Faith in unity. Faith that the Pacific, once scarred by empire, could become a bridge between worlds. History does not heal. People do. And from every island, every coast, every heart once torn by war, faith still burns, quietly, endlessly, across the ocean that once burned with fire. The Pacific, vast, blue, and eternal. It has seen the birth of empires, the fire of war, and the dawn of peace. But after the storm came silence, a silence filled not with fear, but with reflection. Generations now walk the beaches once carved by tanks. Children played in places where soldiers once fell. The ocean had taken back its peace, but never forgot the cost. The Pacific's waves had washed away the blood, but not the memory. Beneath every coral reef, beneath every shipwreck, the ocean whispered the stories of those who never came home. The end of the Pacific War marked the beginning of a new world order. America stood as a global power, its aircraft carriers now symbols not of conquest, but of presence. Across Asia, nations rebuilt, reclaimed, and reinvented. The Pacific became the center of the new century, an ocean of commerce, innovation, and culture. Where battleships once ruled, container ships and airplanes now bridged continents. But the ghosts of the past still lingered, in old treaties, unmarked graves, and memories passed down through stories. History doesn't disappear. It transforms. Empires may die, but their shadows remain. The Pacific's islands, once stepping stones for war, became crossroads of geopolitics. The United States built alliances. The Soviet Union spread ideology. China, Japan, and others sought their place in the new order. The Pacific was no longer a battlefield, but it was far from peaceful. Submarines lurked beneath its depths. Satellites watched from above. The Cold War turned the ocean into a stage of silence, where power moved unseen. Yet even through this tension, nations learned something the war had not taught them, that dominance could not sustain peace. Only cooperation could. The greatest legacy of the Pacific War was not destruction, it was resilience. The survivors, soldiers, civilians, prisoners, carried stories that built bridges between nations. They became living proof that forgiveness is not weakness, it is strength, reborn. In schools, museums, and films, their stories found new life. History became a teacher, not a wound. From tragedy came art. From division came dialogue. From ashes came empathy. Today, the Pacific is the lifeline of our planet. It carries the world's trade, its data cables, its future. But it also carries its memory, the legacy of those who fought, died, and rebuilt upon its shores. From Hawaii to Hiroshima, from Sydney to Seoul, nations once divided now share technology, culture, and hope. The ocean that once burned now powers wind farms and carries research ships, not weapons. The Pacific reminds us, the price of peace is memory. To forget the fire is to invite it again. 80 years have passed since the world set fire to the Pacific. Time has healed the wounds, but the lessons remain. That even in our darkest hours, humanity can rise again. That even after oceans of blood, there can be oceans of peace. The waves that once carried fleets of warships now carry our dreams, our art, our future. The Pacific, the ocean between worlds, has become the ocean that unites them. The fire that once consumed the ocean now burns only in memory. This is how the Pacific remembers,